The year's stay in Pretoria was a most valuable experience in my life. Here it was that I had opportunities of learning public work and acquired some measure of my capacity for it. Here it was that the religious spirit within me became a living force, and here too I acquired a true knowledge of legal practice. Here I learnt the things that a junior barrister learns in a senior barrister's chamber, and here I also gained confidence that I should not after all fail as a lawyer. It was likewise here that I learnt the secret of success as a lawyer. Dada Abdullah's was no small case. The suit was for £40,000. Arising out of business transactions, it was full of intricacies of accounts. Part of the claim was based on promissory notes and part on the specific performance of promise to deliver promissory notes. The defense was that the promissory notes were fraudulently taken and lacked sufficient consideration. There were numerous points of fact and law in this intricate case. Both parties had engaged the best attorneys and counsel. I thus had a fine opportunity of studying their work. The preparation of the plaintiff's case for the attorney and the sorting of facts in support of his case had been entrusted to me. It was an education to see how much the attorney accepted and how much he rejected from my preparation, as also to see how much use the counsel made of the brief prepared by the attorney. I saw that this preparation for the case would give me a fair measure of my powers of comprehension and my capacity for marshalling evidence. I took the keenest interest in the case. Indeed, I threw myself into it. I read all the papers pertaining to the transactions. My client was a man of great ability and reposed absolute confidence in me, and this rendered my work easy. I made a fair study of bookkeeping. My capacity for translation was improved by having to translate the correspondence, which was for the most part in Gujarati. Although, as I have said before, I took a keen interest in religious communion and in public work and always gave some of my time to them, they were not then my primary interest. The preparation of the case was my primary interest. Reading of law and looking up law cases when necessary had always a prior claim on my time. As a result, I acquired such a grasp of the facts of the case as perhaps was not possessed even by the parties themselves, inasmuch as I had with me the papers of both the parties. I recalled the late Mr. Pincut's advice, "Facts are 3/4 of the law." At a later date, it was amply borne out by that famous barrister of South Africa, the late Mr. Leonard. In a certain case in my charge, I saw that, though justice was on the side of my client, the law seemed to be against him. In despair, I approached Mr. Leonard for help. He also felt that the facts of the case were very strong. He exclaimed, "Gandhi, I have learnt one thing, and it is this, that if we take care of the facts of a case, the law will take care of itself. Let us dive deeper into the facts of this case." With these words, he asked me to study the case further and then see him again. On a re-examination of the facts, I saw them in an entirely new light, and I also hit upon an old South African case bearing on the point. I was delighted and went to Mr. Leonard and told him everything. "Right," he said, "we shall win the case. Only we must bear in mind which of the judges takes it." When I was making preparation for Dada Abdullah's case, I had not fully realized this paramount importance of facts. Facts mean truth, and once we adhere to truth, the law comes to our aid naturally. I saw that the facts of Dada Abdullah's case made it very strong indeed, and that the law was bound to be on his side. But I also saw that the litigation, if it were persisted in, would ruin the plaintiff and the defendant, who were relatives and both belonged to the same city. No one knew how long the case might go on. Should it be allowed to continue to be fought out in court, it might go on indefinitely and to no advantage of either party. Both therefore desired an immediate termination of the case if possible. I approached Tayyab Sheth and requested and advised him to go to arbitration. I recommended him to see his counsel. I suggested to him that If an arbitrator commanding the confidence of both parties could be appointed, the case would be quickly finished. The lawyers' fees were so rapidly mounting up that they were enough to devour all the resources of the clients, big merchants as they were. The case occupied so much of their attention that they had no time left for any other work. In the meantime, mutual ill will was steadily increasing. I became disgusted with the profession. As lawyers, the counsel on both sides were bound to rake up points of law in support of their own clients. I also saw for the first time that the winning party never recovers all the costs incurred. Under the court fees regulation, there was a fixed scale of costs to be allowed as between party and party, the actual costs as between attorney and client being very much higher. This was more than I could bear. I felt that my duty was to befriend both parties and bring them together. I strained every nerve to bring about a compromise. At last, Tayyab Sheth agreed. An arbitrator was appointed, the case was argued before him, and Dada Abdullah won. But that did not satisfy me. If my client were to seek immediate execution of the award, it would be impossible for Tayyab Sheth to meet the whole of the awarded amount, and there was an unwritten law among the Porbandar Memons living in South Africa that death should be preferred to bankruptcy. It was impossible for Tayyab Sheth to pay down the whole sum of about £37,000 and costs. He meant to pay not a pie less than the amount, and he did not want to be declared bankrupt. There was only one way. Dada Abdullah should allow him to pay in moderate installments. He was equal to the occasion and granted Tayyab Sheth installments spread over a very long period. It was more difficult for me to secure this concession of payment by installments than to get the parties to agree to arbitration. But both were happy over the result and both rose in public estimation. My joy was boundless. I had learnt the true practice of law. I had learnt to find out the better side of human nature and to enter men's hearts. I realized that the true function of a lawyer was to unite parties riven asunder. The lesson was so indelibly burnt into me that a large part of my time during the 20 years of my practice as a lawyer was occupied in bringing about private compromises of hundreds of cases. I lost nothing thereby, not even money, certainly not my soul. It is now time to turn again to my experiences with Christian friends. Mr. Baker was getting anxious about my future. He took me to the Wellington Convention. The Protestant Christians organize such gatherings every few years for religious enlightenment, or, in other words, self-purification. One may call this religious restoration or revival. The Wellington Convention was of this type. The chairman was the famous divine of the place, the Reverend Andrew Murray. Mr. Baker had hoped that the atmosphere of religious exaltation at the convention and the enthusiasm and earnestness of the people attending it would inevitably lead me to embrace Christianity. But his final hope was the efficacy of prayer. He had an abiding faith in prayer. It was his firm conviction that God could not but listen to prayer fervently offered. He would cite the instances of men like George Muller of Bristol, who depended entirely on prayer even for his temporal needs. I listened to his discourse on the efficacy of prayer with unbiased attention and assured him that nothing could prevent me from embracing Christianity should I feel the call. I had no hesitation in giving him this assurance, as I had long since taught myself to follow the inner voice. I delighted in submitting to it. To act against it would be difficult and painful to me. So we went to Wellington. Mr. Baker was hard put to it in having a colored man like me for his companion. He had to suffer inconveniences on many occasions entirely on account of me. We had to break the journey on the way, as one of the days happened to be a Sunday and Mr. Baker and his party would not travel on the Sabbath. Though the manager of the station hotel agreed to take me in after much altercation, he absolutely refused to admit me to the dining room. Mr. Baker was not the man to give in easily. He stood by the rights of the guests of a hotel, but I could see his difficulty. At Wellington also I stayed with Mr. Baker. In spite of his best efforts to conceal the little inconveniences that he was put to, I could see them all. This convention was an assemblage of devout Christians. I was delighted at their faith. I met the Reverend Murray. I saw that many were praying for me. I liked some of their hymns. They were very sweet. The convention lasted for 3 days. I could understand and appreciate the devoutness of those who attended it, but I saw no reason for changing my belief, my religion. It was impossible for me to believe that I could go to heaven or attain salvation only by becoming a Christian. When I frankly said so to some good Christian friends, they were shocked, but there was no help for it. My difficulties lay deeper. It was more than I could believe that Jesus was the only incarnate Son of God, and that only he who believed in him would have everlasting life. If God could have sons, all of us were his sons. If Jesus was like God or God himself, then all men were like God and could be God himself. My reason was not ready to believe literally that Jesus by his death and by his blood redeemed the sins of the world. Metaphorically, there might be some truth in it. Again, according to Christianity, only human beings had souls and not other living beings for whom death meant complete extinction. While I held a contrary belief, I could accept Jesus as a martyr, an embodiment of sacrifice and a divine teacher, but not as the most perfect man ever born. His death on the cross was a great example to the world, but that there was anything like a mysterious or miraculous virtue in it, my heart could not accept. The pious lives of Christians did not give me anything that the lives of men of other faiths had failed to give. I had seen in other lives just the same reformation that I had heard of among Christians. Philosophically, there was nothing extraordinary in Christian principles. From the point of view of sacrifice, it seemed to me that the Hindus greatly surpassed the Christians. It was impossible for me to regard Christianity as a perfect religion or the greatest of all religions. I shared this mental churning with my Christian friends whenever there was an opportunity, but their answers could not satisfy me. Thus, if I could not accept Christianity either as a perfect or the greatest religion, neither was I then convinced of Hinduism being such. Hindu defects were pressingly visible to me. If untouchability could be a part of Hinduism, it could but be a rotten part or an excrescence. I could not understand the raison d'etre of a multitude of sects and castes. What was the meaning of saying that the Vedas were the inspired word of God? If they were inspired, why not also the Bible and the Quran? As Christian friends were endeavoring to convert me, even so were Mussalman friends. Abdullah Sheikh had kept on inducing me to study Islam, and of course he had always something to say regarding its beauty. I expressed my difficulties in a letter to Ray Chand Bhai. I also corresponded with other religious authorities in India and received answers from them. Ray Chand Bhai's letter somewhat pacified me. He asked me to be patient and to study Hinduism more deeply. One of his sentences was to this effect: "On a dispassionate view of the question, I am convinced that no other religion has the subtle and profound thought of Hinduism, its vision of the soul, or its charity." I purchased Saleh's translation of the Quran and began reading it. I also obtained other books on Islam. I communicated with Christian friends in England. One of them introduced me to Edward Maitland, with whom I opened correspondence. He sent me The Perfect Way, a book he had written in collaboration with Anna Kingsford. The book was a repudiation of the current Christian belief. He also sent me another book, The New Interpretation of the Bible. I liked both. They seemed to support Hinduism. Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You overwhelmed me. It left an abiding impression on me. Before the independent thinking, profound morality, and the truthfulness of this book, all the books given me by Mr. Coates seemed to pale into insignificance. My studies thus carried me in a direction unthought of by the Christian friends. My correspondence with Edward Maitland was fairly prolonged, and that with Ray Chand Bhai continued until his death. I read some of the books he sent me. These included Panchikaran, Maniratna Mala, Mumukshu Prakaran of Yoga Vasishtha, Haribhadra Suri's Shakdarshana Samuchaya and others. Though I took a path my Christian friends had not intended for me, I have remained forever indebted to them for the religious quest that they awakened in me. I shall always cherish the memory of their contact. The years that followed had more, not less, of such sweet and sacred contacts in store for me. The case having been concluded, I had no reason for staying in Pretoria. So I went back to Durban and began to make preparations for my return home. But Abdullah Sheth was not the man to let me sail without a send-off. He gave a farewell party in my honor at Sydenham. It was proposed to spend the whole day there. Whilst I was turning over the sheets of some of the newspapers I found there, I chanced to see a paragraph in a corner of one of them under the caption Indian Franchise. It was with reference to the bill then before the House of Legislature, which sought to deprive the Indians of their right to elect members of the Natal Legislative Assembly. I was ignorant of the bill, and so were the rest of the guests who had assembled there. I inquired of Abdullah Sheth about it. He said, "What can we understand in these matters? We can only understand things that affect our trade. As you know, all our trade in the Orange Free State has been swept away. We agitated about it, but in vain. We are after all lame men, being unlettered. We generally take in newspapers simply to ascertain the daily market rates, etc. What can we know of legislation? Our eyes and ears are the European attorneys here." "But," said I, "there are so many young Indians born and educated here. Do they not help you?" "They," exclaimed Abdullah Sheth in despair, "they never care to come to us, and to tell you the truth, we care less to recognize them. Being Christians, they are under the thumb of the white clergymen, who in their turn are subject to the government." This opened my eyes. I felt that this class should be claimed as our own. Was this the meaning of Christianity? Did they cease to be Indians because they had become Christians? But I was on the point of returning home and hesitated to express what was passing through my mind in this matter. I simply said to Abdullah Sheth, "This bill, if it passes into law, will make our lot extremely difficult. It is the first nail into our coffin. It strikes at the root of our self-respect." "It may," echoed Sheikh Abdullah. "I will tell you the genesis of the franchise question. We knew nothing about it. But Mr. Escombe, one of our best attorneys, whom you know, put the idea into our heads. It happened thus. He is a great fighter, and there being no love lost between him and the wharf engineer, he feared that the engineer might deprive him of his votes and defeat him at the election. So he acquainted us with our position, and at his instance we all registered ourselves as voters and voted for him. You will now see how the franchise has not for us the value that you attach to it, but we understand what you say. Well then, what is your advice?" The other guests were listening to this conversation with attention. One of them said, "Shall I tell you what should be done? You cancel your passage by this boat, stay here a month longer, and we will fight as you direct us." All the others chimed in, "Indeed, indeed. Abdullah Sheth, you must detain Gandhi Bhai." The Sheth was a shrewd man. He said, "I may not detain him now, or rather, you have as much right as I to do so. But you are quite right. Let us all persuade him to stay on. But you should remember that he is a barrister. What about his fees?" The mention of fees pained me, and I broke in. "Abdullah Sheth, fees are out of the question. There can be no fees for public work. I can stay, if at all, as a servant. And as you know, I am not acquainted with all these friends. But if you believe that they will cooperate, I am prepared to stay a month longer. There is one thing, however. Though you need not pay me anything, work of the nature we contemplate cannot be done without some funds to start with. Thus we may have to send telegrams, we may have to print some literature, some touring may have to be done, the local attorneys may have to be consulted, and as I am ignorant of your laws, I may need some law books for reference. All this cannot be done without money, and it is clear that one man is not enough for this work. Many must come forward to help him." And a chorus of voices was heard. "Allah is great and merciful. Money will come in. Men there are, as many as you may need. You please consent to stay, and all will be well." The farewell party was thus turned into a working committee. I suggested finishing dinner etc. quickly and getting back home. I worked out in my own mind an outline of the campaign. I ascertained the names of those who were on the list of voters and made up my mind to stay on for a month. Thus God laid the foundations of my life in South Africa and sowed the seed of the fight for national self-respect. Sheikh Haji Muhammad Haji Dada was regarded as the foremost leader of the Indian community in Natal in 1893. Financially, Sheikh Abdullah Haji Adam was the chief among them, but he and others always gave the first place to Sheikh Haji Muhammad in public affairs. A meeting was therefore held under his presidency at the house of Abdullah Sheikh, at which it was resolved to offer opposition to the franchise bill. Volunteers were enrolled. Natal-born Indians, that is, mostly Christian Indian youths, had been invited to attend this meeting. Mr. Paul, the Durban court interpreter, and Mr. Subhan Godfrey, headmaster of a mission school, were present, and it was they who were responsible for bringing together at the meeting a good number of Christian youths. All these enrolled themselves as volunteers. Many of the local merchants were of course enrolled. Noteworthy among them, Sheikhs Dawood Muhammad, Muhammad Kasam Kamruddin, Adamji Mia Khan, A. Kolandavellu Pillai, C. Lachiram, Rangasamy Padiyachi, and Amod Jiva. Parsi Rustamji was of course there. From among the clerks were Messrs. Manekji, Joshi, Narasimharam, and others, employees of Dada Abdullah and Co., and other big firms. They were all agreeably surprised to find themselves taking a share in public work. To be invited thus to take part was a new experience in their lives. In face of the calamity that had overtaken the community, all distinctions such as high and low, small and great, master and servant, Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Christians, Gujaratis, Madrasis, Sindhis, etc. were forgotten. All were alike the children and servants of the motherland. The bill had already passed or was about to pass its second reading. In the speeches on the occasion, the fact that Indians had expressed no opposition, the stringent bill was urged as proof of their unfitness for the franchise. I explained the situation to the meeting. The first thing we did was to dispatch a telegram to the Speaker of the Assembly requesting him to postpone further discussion of the bill. A similar telegram was sent to the Premier, Sir John Robinson, and other to Mr. Escombe as a friend of Dada Abdullah's. The Speaker promptly replied that discussion of the bill would be postponed for 2 days. This gladdened our hearts. The petition to be presented to the Legislative Assembly was drawn up. 3 copies had to be prepared and 1 extra was needed for the press. It was also proposed to obtain as many signatures to it as possible, and all this work had to be done in the course of a night. The volunteers with a knowledge of English and several others sat up the whole night. Mr. Arthur, an old man who was known for his calligraphy, wrote the principal copy. The rest were written by others to someone's dictation. 5 copies were thus got ready simultaneously. Merchant volunteers went out in their own carriages or carriages whose hire they had paid to obtain signatures to the petition. This was accomplished in quick time and the petition was dispatched. The newspapers published it with favorable comments. It likewise created an impression on the Assembly. It was discussed in the House. Partisans of the bill offered a defense, an admittedly lame one, in reply to the arguments advanced in the petition. The bill, however, was passed. We all knew that this was a foregone conclusion, but the agitation had infused new life into the community and had brought home to them the conviction that the community was one and indivisible, and that it was as much their duty to fight for its political rights as for its trading rights. Lord Ripon was at this time Secretary of State for the colonies. It was decided to submit to him a monster petition. This was no small task and could not be done in a day. Volunteers were enlisted and all did their due share of the work. I took considerable pains over drawing up this petition. I read all the literature available on the subject. My argument centered round a principle and on expedience. I argued that we had a right to the franchise in Natal as we had a kind of franchise in India. I urged that it was expedient to retain it as the Indian population capable of using the franchise was very small. 10,000 signatures were obtained in the course of a fortnight. To secure this number of signatures from the whole of the province was no light task, especially when we considered that the men were perfect strangers to the work. Specially competent volunteers had to be selected for the work, as it had been decided not to take a single signature without the signatory fully understanding the petition. The villages were scattered at long distances. The work could be done promptly only if a number of workers put their whole heart into it, and this they did. All carried out their allotted task with enthusiasm. But as I am writing these lines, figures of Sheikh Dawood Muhammad, Rustamji, Adamji Mia Khan and Amod Jiva rise clearly before my mind. They brought in the largest number of signatures. Dawood Sheikh kept going about in his carriage the whole day, and it was all a labor of love, not one of them asking for even his out-of-pocket expenses. Dada Abdullah's house became at once a caravanserai and a public office. A number of educated friends who helped me and many others had their food there. Thus every helper was put to considerable expense. The petition was at last submitted. 1,000 copies had been printed for circulation and distribution. It acquainted the Indian public for the first time with the conditions in Natal. I sent copies to all the newspapers and publicists I knew. The Times of India, in a leading article on the petition, strongly supported the Indian demands. Copies were sent to journals and publicists in England representing different parties. The London Times supported our claims and we began to entertain hopes of the bill being vetoed. It was now impossible for me to leave Natal. The Indian friends surrounded me on all sides and importuned me to remain there permanently. I expressed my difficulties. I had made up my mind not to stay at public expense. I felt it necessary to set up an independent household. I thought that the house should be good and situated in a good locality. I also had the idea that I could not add to the credit of the community unless I lived in a style usual for barristers. And it seemed to me to be impossible to run such a household with anything less than £300 a year. I therefore decided that I could stay only if the members of the community guaranteed legal work to the extent of that minimum, and I communicated my decision to them. But, said they, we should like you to draw that amount for public work and we can easily collect it. Of course, this is apart from the fees you must charge for private legal work. No, I could not thus charge you for public work, said I. The work would not involve the exercise on my part of much skill as barrister. My work would be mainly to make you all work. And how could I charge you for that? And then I should have to appeal to you frequently for funds for the work, and if I were to draw my maintenance from you, I should find myself at a disadvantage in making an appeal for large amounts, and we should ultimately find ourselves at a standstill. Besides, I want the community to find more than £300 annually for public work. But we have now known you for some time and are sure you would not draw anything you do not need. And if we wanted you to stay here, should we not find your expenses? It is your love and present enthusiasm that make you talk like this. How can we be sure that this love and enthusiasm will endure forever? And as your friend and servant, I should occasionally have to say hard things to you. Heaven only knows whether I should then retain your affection. But the fact is that I must not accept any salary for public work. It is enough for me that you should all agree to entrust me with your legal work. Even that may be hard for you. For one thing, I am not a white barrister. How can I be sure that the court will respond to me? Nor can I be sure how I shall fare as a lawyer. So, even in giving me retainers, you may be running some risk. I should regard even the fact of your giving them to me as the reward of my public work. The upshot of this discussion was that about 20 merchants gave me retainers for 1 year for their legal work. Besides this, Dada Abdullah purchased me the necessary furniture in lieu of a purse he had intended to give me on my departure. Thus I settled in Natal. The symbol of a court of justice is pair of scales held evenly by an impartial and blind but sagacious woman. Fate has purposely made her blind in order that she may not judge a person from his exterior but from his intrinsic worth. But the Law Society of Natal set out to persuade the Supreme Court to act in contravention of this principle and to belie its symbol. I applied for admission as an advocate of the Supreme Court. I held a certificate of admission from the Bombay High Court. The English certificate I had to deposit with the Bombay High Court when I was enrolled there. It was necessary to attach 2 certificates of character to the application for admission, and thinking that these would carry more weight if given by Europeans, I secured them from 2 well-known European merchants whom I knew through Sheikh Abdullah. The application had to be presented through a member of the bar, and as a rule, the Attorney General presented such applications without fees. Mr. Escombe, who, as we have seen, was a legal advisor to Messrs. Dada Abdullah and Co., was the Attorney General. I called on him, and he willingly consented to present my application. The Law Society now sprang a surprise on me by serving me with a notice opposing my application for admission. One of their objections was that the original English certificate was not attached to my application. But the main objection was that when the regulations regarding admission of advocates were made, the possibility of a colored man applying could not have been contemplated. Natal owed its growth to European enterprise, and therefore it was necessary that the European element should predominate in the bar. If colored people were admitted, they might gradually outnumber the Europeans, and the bulwark of their protection would break down. The Law Society had engaged a distinguished lawyer to support their opposition. As he too was connected with Dada Abdullah and Co., he sent me word through Sheikh Abdullah to go and see him. He talked with me quite frankly and inquired about my antecedents, which I gave. Then he said, "I have nothing to say against you. I was only afraid lest you should be some colonial-born adventurer, and the fact that your application was unaccompanied by the original certificate supported my suspicion. There have been men who have made use of diplomas which did not belong to them. The certificates of character from European traders you have submitted have no value for me. What do they know about you? What can be the extent of their acquaintance with you?" "But," said I, "everyone here is a stranger to me. Even Sheikh Abdullah first came to know me here." "But then you say he belongs to the same place as you? If your father was Prime Minister here, Sheikh Abdullah is bound to know your family. If you were to produce his affidavit, I should have absolutely no objection. I would then gladly communicate to the Law Society my inability to oppose your application." This talk enraged me, but I restrained my feelings. If I had attached Dada Abdullah's certificate, said I to myself, it would have been rejected, and they would have asked for European certificates. And what has my admission as advocate to do with my birth and my antecedents? How could my birth, whether humble or objectionable, be used against me? But I contained myself and quietly replied, "Though I do not admit that the Law Society has any authority to require all these details, I am quite prepared to present the affidavit you desire." Sheikh Abdullah's affidavit was prepared and duly submitted to the Council for the Law Society. He said he was satisfied, but not so the Law Society. It opposed my application before the Supreme Court, which ruled out the opposition without even calling upon Mr. Escombe to reply. The Chief Justice said in effect, "The objection that the applicant has not attached the original certificate has no substance. If he has made a false affidavit, he can be prosecuted, and his name can then be struck off the roll if he is proven guilty. The law makes no distinction between white and colored people. The court has therefore no authority to prevent Mr. Gandhi from being enrolled as an advocate. We admit his application. Mr. Gandhi, you can now take the oath." I stood up and took the oath before the registrar. As soon as I was sworn in, the Chief Justice, addressing me, said, "You must now take off your turban, Mr. Gandhi. You must submit to the rules of the court with regard to the dress to be worn by practicing barristers." I saw my limitations. The turban that I had insisted on wearing in the district magistrate's court, I took off in obedience to the order of the Supreme Court. Not that if I had resisted the order, the resistance could not have been justified, but I wanted to reserve my strength for fighting bigger battles. I should not exhaust my skill as a fighter in insisting on retaining my turban. It was worthy of a better cause. Sheikh Abdullah and other friends did not like my submission. They felt that I should have stood by my right to wear the turban while practicing in the court. I tried to reason with them. I tried to press home to them the truth of the maxim, "When at Rome, do as the Romans do." It would be right, I said, to refuse to obey if in India an English officer or judge ordered you to take off your turban, but as an officer of the court, it would have ill become me to disregard a custom of the court in the province of Natal. I pacified the friends somewhat with these and similar arguments, but I do not think I convinced them completely in this instance of the applicability of the principle of looking at a thing from a different standpoint in different circumstances. But all my life through, the very insistence on truth has taught me to appreciate the beauty of compromise. I saw in later life that this spirit was an essential part of Satyagraha. It has often meant endangering my life and incurring the displeasure of friends. But truth is hard as adamant and tender as a blossom. The opposition of the Law Society gave me another advertisement in South Africa. Most of the newspapers condemned the opposition and accused the Law Society of jealousy. The advertisement to some extent simplified my work. Practice as a lawyer was and remained for me a subordinate occupation. It was necessary that I should concentrate on public work to justify my stay in Natal. The dispatch of the petition regarding the disfranchising bill was not sufficient in itself. Sustained agitation was essential for making an impression on the Secretary of State for the colonies. For this purpose, it was thought necessary to bring into being a permanent organization. So, I consulted Sheikh Abdullah and other friends, and we all decided to have a public organization of a permanent character. To find out a name to be given to the new organization perplexed me sorely. It was not to identify itself with any particular party. The name Congress, I knew, was in bad order with the conservatives in England, and yet the Congress was the very life of India. I wanted to popularize it in Natal. It savored of cowardice to hesitate to adopt the name. Therefore, with full explanation of my reasons, I recommended that the organization should be called the Natal Indian Congress, and on the 22nd May, the Natal Indian Congress came into being. Dada Abdullah's spacious room was packed to the full on that day. The Congress received the enthusiastic approval of all present. Its constitution was simple, the subscription was heavy. Only he who paid 5 shillings monthly could be a member. The well-to-do classes were persuaded to subscribe as much as they could. Abdullah Sheikh headed the list with £2 per month. 2 other friends also put down the same. I thought I should not stint my subscription and put down £1 per month. This was for me no small amount, but I thought that I would not be beyond my means if I was to pay my way at all. And God helped me. We thus got a considerable number of members who subscribed £1 per month. The number of those who put down 10 shillings was even larger. Besides this, there were donations which were gratefully accepted. Experience showed that no one paid his subscription for the mere asking. It was impossible to call frequently on members outside Durban. The enthusiasm of one moment seemed to wear away the next. Even the members in Durban had to be considerably dunned before they would pay in their subscriptions. The task of collecting subscriptions lay with me, I being the secretary, and we came to a stage when I had to keep my clerk engaged all day long in the work of collection. The man got tired of the job, and I felt that if the situation was to be improved, the subscriptions should be made payable annually and not monthly, and that too strictly in advance. So I called a meeting of the Congress. Everyone welcomed the proposal for making the subscription annual instead of monthly and for fixing the minimum at £3. Thus the work of collection was considerably facilitated. I had learnt at the outset not to carry on public work with borrowed money. One could rely on people's promises in most matters except in respect of money. I had never found people quick to pay the amounts they had undertaken to subscribe, and the Natal Indians were no exception to the rule. As therefore no work was done unless there were funds on hand, the Natal Indian Congress has never been in debt. My co-workers evinced extraordinary enthusiasm in canvassing members. It was work which interested them and was at the same time an invaluable experience. Large numbers of people gladly came forward with cash subscriptions. Work in the distant villages of the interior was rather difficult. People did not know the nature of public work, and yet we had invitations to visit faraway places, leading merchants of every place extending their hospitality. On one occasion during this tour, the situation was rather difficult. We expected our host to contribute £6, but he refused to give anything more than £3. If we had accepted that amount from him, others would have followed suit and our collections would have been spoiled. It was a late hour of the night and we were all hungry. But how could we dine without having first obtained the amount we were bent on getting? All persuasion was useless. The host seemed to be adamant. Other merchants in the town reasoned with him, and we all sat up throughout the night, he as well as we, determined not to budge 1 inch. Most of my co-workers were burning with rage, but they contained themselves. At last, when day was already breaking, the host yielded, paid down £6 and feasted us. This happened at Tongat, but the repercussion of the incident was felt as far as Stanger on the north coast and Charlestown in the interior. It also hastened our work of collection. But collecting funds was not the only thing to do. In fact, I had long learnt the principle of never having more money at one's disposal than necessary. Meetings used to be held once a month or even once a week if required. Minutes of the proceedings of the preceding meeting would be read, and all sorts of questions would be discussed. People had no experience of taking part in public discussion or of speaking briefly and to the point. Everyone hesitated to stand up to speak. I explained to them the rules of procedure at meetings and they respected them. They realized that it was an education for them, and many who had never been accustomed to speaking before an audience soon acquired the habit of thinking and speaking publicly about matters of public interest. Knowing that in public work minor expenses at times absorbed large amounts, I had decided not to have even the receipt books printed in the beginning. I had a cyclostyle machine in my office on which I took copies of receipts and reports. Such things I began to get printed only when the Congress coffers were full and when the number of members and work had increased. Such economy is essential for every organization, and yet I know that it is not always exercised. That is why I have thought it proper to enter into these little details of the beginnings of a small but growing organization. People never cared to have receipts for the amounts they paid, but we always insisted on the receipts being given. Every pie was thus clearly accounted for, and I dare say the account books for the year 1894 can be found intact even today in the records of a Natal Indian Congress. Carefully kept accounts are a sine qua non for any organization. Without them, it falls into disrepute. Without properly kept accounts, it is impossible to maintain truth in its pristine purity. Another feature of the Congress was service of colonial-born educated Indians. The Colonial-Born Indian Educational Association was founded under the auspices of the Congress. The members consisted mostly of these educated youths. They had to pay a nominal subscription. The association served to ventilate their needs and grievances, to stimulate thought amongst them, to bring them into touch with Indian merchants, and also to afford them scope for service of the community. It was a sort of debating society. The members met regularly and spoke or read papers on different subjects. A small library was also opened in connection with the association. The third feature of the Congress was propaganda. This consisted in acquainting the English in South Africa and England and people in India with the real state of things in Natal. With that end in view, I wrote 2 pamphlets. The first was an appeal to every Briton in South Africa. It contained a statement supported by evidence of the general condition of Natal Indians. The other was entitled The Indian Franchise an Appeal. It contained a brief history of the Indian franchise in Natal with the facts and figures. I had devoted considerable labor and study to the preparation of these pamphlets, and the result was quite commensurate with the trouble taken. They were widely circulated. All this activity resulted in winning the Indians numerous friends in South Africa and in obtaining the active sympathy of all parties in India. It also opened out and placed before the South African Indians a definite line of action. The heart's earnest and pure desire is always fulfilled. In my own experience, I have often seen this rule verified. Service of the poor has been my heart's desire, and it has always thrown me amongst the poor and enabled me to identify myself with them. Although the members of the Natal Indian Congress included the colonial-born Indians and the clerical class, the unskilled wage earners, the indentured laborers were still outside its pale. The Congress was not yet theirs. They could not afford to belong to it by paying the subscription and becoming its members. The Congress could win their attachment only by serving them. An opportunity offered itself when neither the Congress nor I was really ready for it. I had put in scarcely 3 or 4 months' practice, and the Congress also was still in its infancy, when a Tamil man in tattered clothes, headgear in hand, 2 front teeth broken and his mouth bleeding, stood before me, trembling and weeping. He had been heavily belabored by his master. I learnt all about him from my clerk, who was a Tamilian. Balasundaram, as that was the visitor's name, was serving his indenture under a well-known European resident of Durban. The master, getting angry with him, had lost self-control and had beaten Balasundaram severely, breaking 2 of his teeth. I sent him to a doctor. In those days, only white doctors were available. I wanted a certificate from the doctor about the nature of the injury Balasundaram had sustained. I secured the certificate and straightway took the injured man to the magistrate, to whom I submitted his affidavit. The magistrate was indignant when he read it and issued a summons against the employer. It was far from my desire to get the employer punished. I simply wanted Balasundaram to be released from him. I read the law about indentured labor. If an ordinary servant left service without giving notice, he was liable to be sued by his master in a civil court. With the indentured labor, the case was entirely different. He was liable in similar circumstances to be proceeded against in a criminal court and to be imprisoned on conviction. That is why Sir William Hunter called the indenture system almost as bad as slavery. Like the slave, the indentured laborer was the property of his master. There were only 2 ways of releasing Balasundaram, either by getting the protector of indentured laborers to cancel his indenture, or transfer him to someone else, or by getting Balasundaram's employer to release him. I called on the latter and said to him, "I do not want to proceed against you and get you punished. I think you realize that you have severely beaten the man. I shall be satisfied if you will transfer the indenture to someone else." To this he readily agreed. I next saw the protector. He also agreed on condition that I found a new employer. So I went off in search of an employer. He had to be a European, as no Indians could employ indentured labor. At that time I knew very few Europeans. I met one of them. He very kindly agreed to take on Balasundaram. I greatly acknowledged his kindness. The magistrate convicted Balasundaram's employer and recorded that he had undertaken to transfer the indenture to someone else. Balasundaram's case reached the ears of every indentured laborer, and I came to be regarded as their friend. I hailed this connection with delight. A regular stream of indentured laborers began to pour into my office, and I got the best opportunity of learning their joys and sorrows. The echoes of Balasundaram's case were heard in far-off Madras. Laborers from different parts of the province who went to Natal on indenture came to know of this case through their indentured brethren. There was nothing extraordinary in the case itself, but the fact that there was someone in Natal to espouse their cause and publicly work for them gave the indentured laborer a joyful surprise and inspired him with hope. I have said that Balasundaram entered my office headgear in hand. There was a peculiar pathos about the circumstance which also showed our humiliation. I have already narrated the incident when I was asked to take off my turban. A practice had been forced upon every indentured laborer and every Indian stranger to take off his headgear when visiting a European, whether the headgear were a cap, turban or a scarf wrapped round the head. A salute even with both hands was not sufficient. Balasundaram thought that he should follow the practice even with me. This was the first case in my experience. I felt humiliated and asked him to tie up his scarf. He did so, not without a certain hesitation, but I could perceive the pleasure on his face. It has always been a mystery to me how men can feel themselves honored by the humiliation of their fellow beings.